and welcome to Sacred Harmony. I'm Simon Lole, and after a lifetime spent working as an organist and director of music in churches and cathedrals across the UK, I want to share some of my passion for church music with you. We're going to discover the story behind some famous hymns. I'll be talking to the liturgist, Canon Jeremy Davis, and we'll be exploring the legacy of the priest, poet and hymn writer George Herbert. We'll also be joined by our quartet, who'll be singing for us later in the show. Now, if I asked you which hymn has been acclaimed as the greatest hymn ever written, what would you come up with? Most probably you wouldn't think of Charles Wesley's "Jesu, lover of my soul," would you? But that's the accolade that it's often been afforded. It's certainly considered to be one of Wesley's best, which is pretty impressive from a man who wrote over 6,000 hymns. It speaks of the security and refuge that we find in Jesus. Even in the midst of storms and tempests, he is our safe haven. Thou, O Christ, art all I want, more than all in thee I find. Charles Wesley was born in 1707, the son of an Anglican cleric and poet, Samuel Wesley, and he was one of 19 children. He had a privileged education and studied at Westminster School and then at Christ Church, Oxford, where he formed a prayer group amongst his contemporaries who focused on studying the Bible and living a holy life. They were often mocked for being too detailed and methodical in their study and their disciplined lifestyle, hence the name Methodists. After graduating with a master's degree, Charles followed his father into the ministry. Soon after, Charles and his younger brother John set sail to America to work in Georgia. John as a civil servant and Charles as a chaplain. But they didn't stay long and were soon back in Britain, and both felt the calling to preach the gospel to ordinary people. It was at this time that he started writing all the hymns for which he's now so well known. Hymns such as "Love Divine, All Loves Excelling," "Over 1,000 Tongues to Sing," and "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." So what about "Jesu, Lover of My Soul"? As I mentioned earlier, it's recognised as one of Wesley's greatest hymns, but its origins are subject to some speculation, but they're good stories anyway. Perhaps the most well-known and most plausible story about the writing of this hymn concerns a visit that Charles made to Ireland. He was preaching at one of his open-air meetings when a number of people took exception to what he was saying and tried to assault him. He fled and escaped to a nearby farmhouse where the farmer's wife hid him in a milk house. When the mob approached the farm, the farmer's wife tried to divert them with an offer of refreshment. Worried that the protesters might search her premises, she encouraged Wesley to leave, and he took refuge and hid under a nearby hedge. From his hiding place, which was situated by a small stream, he could hear the angry voices of his pursuers. As he waited for them to go, it's reputed that he wrote the words of "Jesu, lover of my soul" as a prayer of trust in God as his refuge. Another story is that he wrote it on the boat back from America, and as he got caught in a storm, it inspired him to portray the thoughts of a Christian in deadly peril. Yet another story is that as he stood by an open window one summer's day, a little bird, pursued by a hawk, took refuge in the folds of his coat, giving him the idea of expressing that one's soul is one sure place of refuge in time of need. Whatever the exact details of how Wesley came to write it, there's no doubt of its popularity. To date, it's been included in over 2,000 hymnals. It wasn't paired with the Welsh tune Aberystwyth that we all know so well today until many years after it was written. But for me, the marriage of the two is a match made in heaven. One story about the hymn that's always moved me is of a gathering of veterans from both sides of the American Civil War. They were sharing stories, and an elderly Confederate recalled that he was on patrol one day and came across a sentry from the opposing side. Aiming his gun, he was ready to pull the trigger when the sentry burst into song. "Jesu, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly." The gunman paused and listened as the Union Guard continued to sing, "Cover my defenseless head with the shadow of thy wing." The The first soldier put his gun down and walked away. The Union Guard said he was singing the hymn to keep his spirits up, but little did he know that it was to save his life. Throughout its history, the hymn has received occasional resistance from those that consider the language to be too intimate to be addressing God. But it's a hymn that stood the test of time and rightly deserves to be known as one of the greatest hymns ever written. Singing "Jesu, Lover of My Soul," I'm really thrilled to introduce our quartet. I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Canon Jeremy Davis. Jeremy, welcome to Sacred Harmony.
Thank you, Simon. It's lovely to be here.
Now, you and I were colleagues at Salisbury Cathedral when I was the Director of Music and you were the precentor. Can you give us a flavour of what the role of the precentor is in a cathedral?
Well, it might be best to say what the word precentor means. Preces cantor, two Latin words, the singer of the prayers. Well, in fact, I did sing the prayers a lot.
Very well.
Thank you. But since the cathedral was founded in 1075, the precentor's role has been to look after the liturgy, that is, the worship of the church, the services that took place, to rehearse them, regulate them, rehearse them, yes, but also to so often to devise services for the church.
Mm-hmm. And I'm aware probably there's a challenge to a precentor, or indeed to any priest who's organising services, that change needs to happen. You need to keep up with the times. I mean, what are the challenges today for a priest looking at music?
Well, managing change is part of any priest's life, and not least with regard to the liturgy, to the services that take place in church. Mm-hmm. Services don't come out of the ether. They are part of a tradition. And in the Church of England, there's a long tradition of beautiful church services.
Yeah.
And yet, as you suggest, times change. And that needs to be reflected in our services, in the language we use, indeed, how we address God and who can address God. Is it just the priest who can stand at the altar and address God? Or is it the whole community gathered together, often given voice by the priest, but having time and place for the whole community to come together in worship? And that's been part of the direction of travel of contemporary worship today.
Yeah. And do you think choirs are essential?
I don't think choirs are essential. Choirs come out of congregations. And I think the more essential question is music essential? St. Augustine said, "Those who sing pray twice." I'm not sure he did actually say that, but it's attributed to him.
Yes.
And there is something in that about the quality of prayer, the way our hearts and minds are lifted with our voices in praise and prayer to God, and therefore music is essential. Very often that music is helped by choirs, and as you know, there are 43 cathedrals in England. Every day, almost every day, choirs in cathedrals sing amazing music.
Yes.
That keeps the tradition going. But the congregation shouldn't be forgotten in that. The congregation is the basic unit of music making as of worship in the church.
I do actually remember a member of the Salisbury congregation once saying to me that the only difference between us, i.e. the choir, and them, the congregation, was the fact that we practiced more than they did. So
And sang more difficult music.
and sang more difficult music, indeed. Yeah. But as you say, music is a very powerful tool. I mean, what sort of qualities do you think it can bring to the church and indeed more to the community as a large?
Well, I think one of the important things about music, whether it's sacred or secular, is its emotional charge. And one of the things that went out of the window, to some degree at any rate, at the Reformation, although we were left with a beautiful liturgy crafted by Thomas Cranmer, nevertheless, the emotional charge of music was important. The Reformation seemed to privilege the word, the spoken word, and the Reformation became a very noisy time, not only the word of God being spoken, but everyone chattering away, primacy given to the sermon. Music reminds us of how we transcend the ordinary, how we look towards heaven. And so the emotional charge is important. And as we know from hymn singing, I was brought up as a Welsh Baptist, so I know all about hymn singing.
Indeed.
And in the Church of England,
Yes.
there is a great tradition of hymn singing. Hymns bind a congregation together. Music binds an assembly together into one. And also, as John Wesley, Charles Wesley, Luther, and so on understood, hymns are a way of teaching. Some of the fundamental truths about Christianity are conveyed in our hymns, and when you have a wonderful tune to go with significant words, then these remain with us for the rest of our lives.
Yes.
Music can do all these, or help to do all these things.
Yes, that's very true. And just as an aside, I just wonder, when you were talking about congregational singing there, do you think sometimes if you have an excellent choir in your church or your cathedral, do you think that can sometimes hinder congregational singing? The congregation think, it'll be all right, the choir will do this.
I think a congregation can learn through cathedral worship, for instance, to participate in another way. When I go to a monastery in France, for example, I don't expect to join in with the plain song.
No.
I love to listen to the monks singing and let it waft over me. I don't feel I'm being distant from participation in what is going on. And similarly with cathedral worship. There is another kind of participation when, as I was suggesting earlier, the whole congregation, during the hymns or through a setting of the Holy Communion service, where it's not just left to the choir to do it, but very often the choir can take us into another world, transport us, raise our hearts and minds.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's very special. Now, Jeremy, changing tack slightly, having worked with you for a long time, I remember that one of your favourite poets was George Herbert, who lived and worked for quite a while near Salisbury. What qualities about his poetry inspire you, and why do you love him so much?
He was a wit. He managed to combine, you don't read George Herbert for laughs, frankly,
No.
but wit in the sense of inventiveness, cleverness in his poetry, conveying some very profound religious truths, theological truths. All his poetry are concerned with God when they're not concerned with his own unworthiness before God. So his poems provide us with poetry of penitence and repentance, but more often about the King of Glory. He's turning his eyes and his heart and his imagination towards heaven. And you don't get anything trite in George Herbert. There's an emotional quality to them. there's power, there's often simplicity, despite the density. Sometimes it's difficult to understand on a first reading what a George Herbert poem is about, and it's worth rereading and living with, as often with good poetry. But at the heart of it, there's a kind of simple profundity which comes across, and that's why I go back to him time and again.
So do you have a favourite poem?
By George Herbert?
Indeed.
Love Bade Me Welcome.
I thought you were going to say that. Could you give us a little bit of it?
Sure. Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack, from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat.
Wonderful. Quite magical.
It is wonderful.
I miss hearing you read all those lovely poems in the cathedral. So one more question, Jeremy. You're officially retired, but that's a bit of a joke, really. Whenever I see you, you seem to be gallivanting somewhere else. What future plans have you got? What sort of things are you doing at the moment?
Well, on Friday, I'm going up to Cambridge, to my old college, Corpus Christi, where they're awaiting the arrival of a new dean who doesn't come until January. So I'm going to be there for the beginning of term to look after the undergraduates and the dons and so on, and to take the services there. And after that, I'm going to America in January to... there's a wonderful organization called American Sarum, trying to build links between America and what's called the Sarum Use, which is the medieval liturgy of Salisbury. And there's a great deal of interest in America, and they often ask me to go over there and lecture to them on the Sarum Use, which I'm very glad to do.
So life is not at all dull for you?
It's not dull at all.
Excellent. Well, Jeremy, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you,
It's been a great pleasure. I've long been fascinated by George Herbert's poetry myself, and some of his great hymns, amongst the best known being King of Glory, King of Peace, Teach Me, my God and King, and Let All the World in Every Corner Sing. As a musician and composer myself, I can see how attractive his poetry is to set to music. In fact, over 90 of his poems have been set for singing over the centuries, some of them multiple times. Beginning around his own lifetime, both Henry Purcell and John Blow set his poems. Over 40 were adapted and used for the Methodist hymnal by John and Charles Wesley, including the 3 hymns I just mentioned. Composers of the 20th century had a particular fascination with his work. Amongst these were Edmund Rubbra, who set the poem Easter, Ralph Vaughan Williams, who used 4 of his poems in his 5 mystical songs, including our very favourite poem, Love Bade Me Welcome. Both Benjamin Britten and William Walton were inspired by his poetry, as is the contemporary English composer Judith Weir and the American Ned Rorem. So what do we know about this fascinating man? He was born in Powys in Wales in 1593, 29 years after the birth of Shakespeare and 10 years before the death of Queen Elizabeth I. He was born to a very well-to-do, wealthy family and was the 7th of 10 children. His father, Richard, was a member of Parliament and Justice of the Peace, and later served for a number of years as High Sheriff of the county. However, sadly, Richard died when George was only 3, leaving his mother, Magdalene, to bring up 7 boys and 3 girls on her own. By all accounts, she was quite a remarkable woman, strong, well-educated, very beautiful, and devoutly religious, and an important influence on George. Magdalene was also a great friend and supporter of the celebrated poet and later priest and dean of St Paul's Cathedral, John Donne. In fact, John became George's godfather. The family moved to Oxford and then on to London, and George was sent to Westminster School, where he became an academic scholar. And then he moved to Trinity College, Cambridge in 1609, where he excelled with a first-class degree and followed that with a master's degree by the age of 23. He was soon elected a fellow of the college, and so highly respected was he in his academic prowess, and particularly in his knowledge of Greek and Latin, that he was appointed to be the university's public orator, a job not only to oversee Latin instruction at Cambridge, but also, in the days before the poet laureateship, to provide verses in Latin to celebrate state occasions. Inevitably, many saw this early prominence for a man who moved in such exalted social circles as leading to state office of the highest order. But for all this good fortune, Herbert suffered with bad health throughout much of his life, being affected by some sort of consumption, possibly TB. He also appears to be a man who, having satisfied an ambition, found himself dissatisfied, in his particular case, with the position of orator. At this point in his life, there appears to be a massive turning point, as his poems speak of his struggle with worldly ambition. He turned his back on academia and a career in the offices of state and turned to the church. In 1626, he was offered a living in Leighton Bromswold in Lincolnshire, though not ordained. He raised money to restore the rather neglected church there and started his calling as a man of God. In 1629, he decided to enter the priesthood and was appointed rector of the small rural parish of Bemerton, just outside of Salisbury in Wiltshire. This was to be the most fruitful period of his short life. Together with his wife Jane, whom he had recently married, he ministered to his people, preached, and wrote poetry. Most famously, whilst at Bemerton, he used to walk along the riverside to Salisbury Cathedral for evensong, an experience he described as his heaven on earth. Whilst at Bemerton, Herbert revised and added to his most important collection of poems entitled The Temple. He also wrote a fascinating guide to rural ministry called The Country Parson, His Character and Rule of Holy Life. But sadly, Herbert's time at Bemerton was short. Having suffered most of his life from poor health, in 1633 he died, possibly of consumption, only 3 years after taking holy orders. His reputation rests mainly with the poems in the middle section of the Temple entitled The Church. All of them are on religious themes and are characterized by a directness of expression, written in a rather playful way, yet containing serious messages. W.H. Auden once described them as expressions of Anglican piety at its very best. Herbert himself wrote, "My meaning is in all these sonnets to declare my resolution to be, that my poor abilities in poetry shall be all and ever consecrated to God's glory." Herbert's relationship to God through his poems is fascinatingly ambiguous at times. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back. As the speaker continues to insist on his unworthiness, love encourages him to sit down and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Sacred Harmony. Our quartet are going to sing us out now with George Herbert's wonderful hymn, King of Glory, King of Peace.
I will